Welcome everyone. Today we have Elias Stassinos with us. Elias, welcome. Buddha said that the problem is the suffering in the world. What is the cause of our suffering?
The cause is delusion from identification with the conditioned social self. As children, we start our lives normally without delusion. We do have a certain personality based on genetic tendencies, but we start innocently from pure awareness, consciousness, which is our true self and true state. So, as children, we have clear, unconditioned experience of our being, natural spontaneity, and direct experience of life as it is. However, gradually, as we are growing up, social conditioning begins. Language creates the I, me identity and starts forming a story, which builds up roles that get internalized by our true self, our consciousness. The delusion occurs with our identification with our ego mind. Consciousness believing it's the ego self gets lost in the social ego self and takes on the limited ego identity. At the same time, consciousness forgets its original nature. So consciousness becomes the ego, somebody, a limited ego, self-existing and only existing as thoughts in our minds. So delusion happens when we start believing thoughts, take on social roles, accept limitations, and when we build a personal story. We create a psychological time, like getting hypnotized into a dream of our personal story in our mind. So our mind creates an illusion and then believes in that illusion of self. Social conditioning creates the ego mind. The socially created conditioned ego mind is the agent that gets what the ego wants in life. In so doing, it is suffering because most of the time it does not get what it wants. Our samskaras and vasanas exacerbate the suffering because each time we identify with the conditioned self, it reinforces the samskaras and vasanas in our nervous system. That is why the delusion is so persistent. It is because we really believe, we are absolutely sure of our thoughts and that we are the socially conditioned character we believe we are in our minds. Samskaras are the raw imprints left by each experience. Vasanas are the deep-seated tendencies or inclinations formed by these imprints over time. These are the mental patterns that control our behavior and beliefs. Samskaras are like mental and emotional imprints left by past actions, thoughts, or experiences that formed in the mind and the deeper layers of consciousness. Vasanas are the tendencies, inclinations, or subtle desires that arise from accumulated samskaras. In behavioral psychology, samskaras can also be seen as conditioned responses, automatic reactions built up over time through repeated associations and experiences. That is why the self in delusion is like a robot. The conditioned self just follows patterns. The ego self is a collection of small programs created from social conditioning. Our behavior is automatic, like a robot's behavior. Vasanas closely resemble behavioral tendencies or habits, which are established patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that arise from repeated reinforcement of certain behaviors and attitudes. Samskaras and vasanas could be compared to how implicit memories and early conditioning feed into broader personality traits and habitual behaviors. Vasanas are subconscious tendencies, like survival instincts, in evolutionary psychology. These instincts are automatic and often operate beneath conscious awareness, influencing our actions, perceptions, and choices. They keep us in a constant reactive and robotic state. The delusion of the self is a veil over our true nature. Because samskaras and vasanas are essentially mental and emotional patterns rooted in ignorance, they veil the direct experience of pure awareness. They distract attention outward, toward desires, fears, and the play of duality, obscuring the innate sense of wholeness and unity. So they keep the vicious cycle of desire and seeking. The modern equivalent of samskaras is genetic predispositions. Modern science recognizes that our DNA carries certain genetic predispositions, such as a tendency toward aggression, empathy, or fear responses, which can influence our behavior. On a broader level, humanity's collective survival instincts could be seen as collective vasanas, shared tendencies that have persisted across generations. These include inclinations to avoid risk, seek shelter, and form social bonds as they have proven advantageous for survival.
From the non-dual perspective, these collective vasanas keep not just individual consciousness in delusion but the collective, universal mind. They are deeply embedded in the psyche and subtly drive not only personal but also cultural behaviors. You mention evolutionary psychology. How does that connect with suffering and liberation?
Evolutionary psychologists know the cause of that suffering. It is our survival drives that create the delusion and the suffering. This is crucial. Our basic survival drives for food, safety, reproduction aren't inherently problematic. But in our modern world, these natural drives get hijacked and reinforced into extreme patterns like greed, chronic anxiety, desperate loneliness. Understanding this evolutionary basis helps us see why we suffer without blaming ourselves. The beautiful thing is that when we really understand what causes these patterns, we can live naturally without getting caught in their extremes. As Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." That's not just a spiritual saying. It's a practical reality about how understanding the nature of the ego mind awakens us from the delusion and dissolves suffering. To understand how patterns keep us deluded, let's take a common delusional pattern, such as the endless seeking for happiness through achievement. From an evolutionary perspective, this drive helped our ancestors survive, but now it creates a cycle of chronic dissatisfaction. For example, someone might get the promotion they wanted, feel happy briefly, then immediately start seeking the next thing. The evolutionary drive for achievements is based on the survival instinct's belief that there is lack of resources. So, the lack we feel, the sense that something is missing, creates the desire for accumulation of resources, titles, things, relationships, etc. That is why the ego-created self in our minds is never satisfied. The ego thoughts arise from an imprinted lack pattern deep in our DNA and nervous system. In non-duality, these patterns are called vasanas. The ego is tied to the body that is subject to millions of years of evolutionary patterns. So, the ego creates this chronic dissatisfaction because it believes there are not enough resources for survival. The key insight is to awaken from the delusion and see how the mind creates suffering through mental patterns, such as constant seeking. When you really understand this pattern, you can still work and achieve, but without the psychological suffering. The liberated person still acts in the world fulfilling his duties, but lives in peace, resting in his awareness.
You mentioned truth being truth, whether through microscope or meditation. Can you give us a concrete example of how science and non-dual understanding complement each other?
Let's take anxiety, something many people struggle with. Science shows us how the amygdala in our brains triggers fight or flight responses, how stress hormones flood our system, how neural pathways get strengthened through repetition. This explains the mechanics of anxiety. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, anxiety likely evolved as a survival mechanism that helped our ancestors detect and respond to potential threats. Heightened awareness, rapid heartbeat, fear response would have helped humans avoid predators, environmental dangers, and social threats. But in our modern world, the same mechanism gets triggered by a critical email or a social media post. Understanding this helps us stop identifying with anxiety and blaming ourselves for these reactions. Now, non-dual understanding takes us deeper. It shows us that we're not these thoughts and reactions. We're the awareness in which they appear. This isn't just philosophy, it's direct experience. When you're anxious, you're aware of the anxiety. That awareness itself is never anxious. The understanding that anxiety is a survival mechanism reaction that is not needed, and the knowledge that thoughts do not define who we are, is where real freedom lies. When you really see this, not just intellectually but in your own experience, something shifts. You can still work and achieve, but without the psychological suffering. You can leave the snake alone once you see it's actually a rope. The fear, the delusion, disappears through understanding.
You mentioned peace that's already here, but many people might say, well, that sounds nice, but I have real problems to deal with.
Let's take relationships, for example. Many people feel a deep sense of loneliness or a compulsive need for partnership. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Social bonds were crucial for survival. But today, this natural drive often becomes distorted into painful patterns of dependency, jealousy, and fear of abandonment. The conventional approach is to try to fix these feelings. Find the perfect partner, work on self-improvement, follow relationship advice. But here's where non-dual understanding reveals something profound. The very search for completion through another person reinforces the sense of incompleteness and keep us in delusion.
But how does understanding these patterns actually help in daily life?
Let me give you a concrete example. Say you're in a relationship and feeling intense jealousy. The typical approach might be to either suppress these feelings or act them out. But when you understand both the evolutionary basis of these emotional patterns, and you also become aware of your true nature as consciousness, something different happens. You can see the pattern of jealousy arise, understand it as an evolutionary protection mechanism, and recognize that you're the awareness in which this emotion appears. This isn't about suppressing the feeling. It's about seeing it clearly for what it is, just an emotional pattern. The freedom comes through understanding, not through trying to change or fix anything. Let me share another scenario many can relate to. Checking your phone first thing in the morning and seeing a work email that triggers anxiety. Most self-help books might tell you to practice better email boundaries or morning routines. But let's break this down from multiple angles. First, the evolutionary perspective. Our brain treats email threats like physical threats, same stress response that helped our ancestors survive predators. Then, the psychological pattern. Thoughts spiral into future scenarios, creating more anxiety. What if I lose my job? How will I pay my bills? But here's where non-dual understanding comes in. Right in that moment of anxiety, you can notice something profound. You're aware of all this happening. The thoughts, the physical sensations, the emotional reaction, they're all appearing in awareness. That awareness itself is completely untouched by the drama.
Can you give another example, perhaps from relationships?
Sure. Take scrolling through social media and seeing your ex with someone new. Instantly, there's a rush of emotions, comparative thoughts, maybe even the urge to check their profile repeatedly. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. Social bonds meant survival, and perceived rejection triggered protective responses. But when you understand these patterns, you can see them play out without being completely identified with them. You might still feel the emotion, but you're not totally consumed by it. It's like watching weather patterns move through the sky of awareness.
These examples are quite relatable. But what about bigger life challenges, career decisions, major life changes?
Consider someone stuck in a successful but unfulfilling career. The mind says, I should be happy. I have status, good income, security. Yet there's this persistent feeling of emptiness. The evolutionary drive for status and security can trap us in golden cages. But rather than advocating radical change, understanding these patterns allows us to make clearer decisions from a place of wisdom rather than conditioning. Here's a powerful example of identity that many will recognize: looking in the mirror and feeling dissatisfied. This simple daily moment can trigger a cascade of self-judgment. Let's break it down. Evolutionarily, our appearance mattered for survival and reproduction. That made sense. But today, this natural concern becomes massively amplified by social media, advertising, and cultural conditioning. The mind creates a narrative, a story. If I just looked different, I'd be happier, more successful, more loved. We need to learn how to recognize this pattern while it's happening. You're looking in the mirror. Thoughts arise to create a story about not being good enough. Emotions follow. But who's aware of all this? This simple question points to something profound. The awareness that sees these thoughts isn't itself concerned with appearance. This understanding itself begins to dissolve the compulsion, not through force, but through seeing clearly that these thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are just patterns. This applies even to deeply ingrained patterns. If we slowly recognize these patterns through asking ourselves, who is thinking these thoughts, who is feeling these emotions, we will see there is no one that is experiencing them. They are just automatic patterns.
Be self-realized, recognize these patterns and that there is no imaginary self that is experiencing the story in your mind. Created by Hypnotizes. If you found this video helpful, please comment, subscribe and like.